In a short half an hour, we're going to teach you everything that you need to know about running sims. Absolutely not. I think everyone who's run any simulations well and truly knows that it takes a long time to actually figure out exactly what you want to do. And the hardest thing about simulation is the sitting down and thinking about it beforehand. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about the deconstructing of some of the elements behind simulation, or there's a lot more behind it. And I'm mindful that a lot of you have run scenarios before, so this is taking it to a little bit deeper in some respects, but there will be there's a lot more that you can learn from that. So we're going to think about deconstructing the simulation that's there. There's a lot of preparation and planning that goes into running a scenario. In fact, if anything, the actual scenario itself is part of the easy part, and strangely enough, the medicine's actually the easier bit once you're actually doing it than some of the other elements that go in behind a simulation. And then, as you well and truly are aware, with simulation, the bulk of the work's in the preparation, then in the planning. The running of the sim is such a small fraction of it, and then Andrew's going to actually talk through some debriefing components, which is actually an incredibly important component of the simulation to make sure that you meet the learning objectives for what you want to do, get out of the scenario and get out of the education episode, which is really just the scenario itself. So I want you to think about this quote that I read actually next door to Wollongong Base, which is about experience and judgment. And you certainly need to consider the fact that what we're trying to do with simulation is actually put someone in a situation either before they've been in it or sometimes even after they've been in that situation to see what we can learn from that actual event. And see what we can do, whether we can do things differently, whether we can change things, whether we can learn as educators something from our participants. And I think the overarching thing that we need to remember in sim is curiosity, and go into each simulation with curiosity for what the participants do and also how they run that. And that's actually quite an interesting challenge sometimes. So I'm going to show you a video. Unfortunately, I couldn't work out how to embed it, so we'll see if this works.
Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated.
All right, Mr. Vile, is it?
My friends call me Flem.
Uh-huh. Mr. Vile, can you tell me what you did wrong?
I fell down.
No, before that. Can anyone tell me Mr. Vile's big mistake? Anyone? Let's take a look at the tape. There we go. Right. There. See? The door. You left it wide open. And leaving the door open is the worst mistake any employee can make because...
It could let in a draft?
It could let in a child.
Oh, Mr. Water News.
There's nothing more toxic or deadly than a human child. A single touch could kill you.
So,
Turn the light back on.
yeah, cool. I think that video really demonstrates some of the really good, important bits about simulation. So the realism of what actually happens in the situation, and the importance of actually then going on to do a proper debrief. And I think that that's obviously an example of some really fantastic debriefing. It really points out some of the really negative things that the monster does, and does it in such a belittling way that it really will make sure that their emotions have been heightened, and they've really taken a lot to learn from the situation. They'll definitely never, ever leave the door open ever again, I'm sure. Andrew will talk a little bit more about the effect of debriefing on people later on. So preparation and planning is really essential, and that's why we fight like we train. And this is actually one of the training models from London Thames, and Weaver, I'll be very pleased to know, is still, I believe, still to this day, the fastest person at doing this giant operation game. I think she's got it down to a grand total of 17 seconds for doing this. So you need to fight like you train, so it's important to do that. But preparing and planning is actually you need to sit and think about everything that could go wrong in a simulation. So whether the door's left open or closed and how you respond to that. Certainly, I know that one case that we see regularly is the adrenaline doses that are given for anaphylaxis, and what people do with those anaphylaxis doses. You need to know how to respond to those things. So part of the components of simulation that you need to think about is what happens for the medical elements, but then also what happens for everything else. So for those non-technical, the CRM, the human factors type components of the simulation, and you need to think of how you respond to each of those. And that all comes back to preparation and planning, which means that the person that's in there, the faculty or the confederate you'll see sometimes in the simulation literature, but your simulation faculty who are built into the scenario. So in our situation, it might be a nurse or a paramedic. It may even be a doctor that's there as faculty that can help to drive the scenario from within. But in order to do that, they need to be so well versed that in what is supposed to happen and what could happen, and how to respond to that and how to dig people out of holes, that actually it can happen in a seamless way. Because actually the most important thing with sim is actually to think about realism. So the pre-reading that we had for this session today was all of the 11s. So it's thinking about the 11 components that actually make the preparation and planning for a curriculum development for simulation, then also for the individual scenario, and then again further about the broader aspects of sim into an entire curriculum for education. Going through to think about what components you need to make up a simulation, these are some of the key things that are there. So who are the learners? Where are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? But actually the overarching thing for everything is actually to think about what are our learning objectives for the simulation, and that's really thinking about where to start. So you need to think about what do you want people to actually take home from a sim, and that's essential for that. And I think that's probably the hardest thing to do, and certainly the thing that I spend the most time thinking about is what do I actually want someone to get out of the simulation? And so it can be what is for the Monsters Inc. one, you can kind of think about the fact that the learning objective for that is about how do you scare children, but actually what are the other factors that go into that, making that a really important component. And it is about avoiding hazards within the simulation and making sure that those things are achieved. And I think that that's such an incredibly important thing to come up with, that we need to think about doing that for each one. And especially for the quick in situ ones, it's really important because it can be quite dangerous if you go into it without thinking about those things to start with. So what are all the pieces of the puzzle? So in terms of creating realism, which is what we need to do, we need to think about the physical, the medical, and then the emotional. And actually, of everything, it's actually the emotional component that will drive essentially how somebody responds to the simulation and whether they take a learning objective home appropriately. It's putting people into that right band of emotional awareness in the simulation that means that they're either not bored, which is often what can happen, but also the other way is you don't want to have them too overstimulated, because otherwise they'll just lose the point completely. And I think that's something that we need to think really long and hard about. How do you put people into that band? And all of the other factors go together to help people with that. So you need to really contemplate what is the medical level that you want them to be at, and what is the human factors level that you want them to be at, and how do we actually do that? So in terms of the medicine, as I said, it's probably one of the easiest parts to do, but the key factor is knowing how the physiology will respond to things that people do. Often I find one of the tricks is that people want to be all wild and wacky with their medicine. And that's often a really detrimental thing, because actually if we make up a case and we're trying to run it on the fly, we'll often stuff up the physiology, and that actually then detracts from the realism, especially if you've got somebody, if it doesn't fit together, if you can't make it fit, then actually it makes it so that people are actually questioning, and then they fall out of that suspended disbelief, if you like, which is one of those words that's often bandied around in sin. You know, asking people to suspend their disbelief means that we're actually asking them to believe that we're not actually putting them in a real situation. Really, what we want to do is actually have them so emotionally involved in their headspace of being involved that they actually don't have any disbelief that this is actually where they are and they're treating this patient. So it's important to really consider that. So do think about how you put together your cases and make sure that the cases make sense. Which means if you are going to do something wild and wacky, which is not a problem, or put them in a situation that you've not experienced before, or something that seems a little bit out of left field, research it, actually find a case, get the physiological parameters from there, go through old case notes and find them and actually run the cases if that's what it was at the time, so that actually people believe what's there. This goes back to the orthopedics, really. The people that are in the simulation have actually a huge impact on what we do. We've all seen the caricatures performed in simulation, and actually sometimes it really can detract a lot from the simulation that's there. If every anaesthetist wants to give Aramin at every second, actually eventually in this service I think we'd end up laughing too much because it's going to do it, because it's Carl's caricature of the situation. We've all seen the caricature of the bumbling surgeon, the orthopaedic surgeon who doesn't necessarily know what they're doing. And in actual fact, that's not really fair to our colleagues, but also it can detract from the simulation that's there, because actually you just want to laugh at them, especially if you actually know the person. So in our service, where you might actually know the person that's actually acting in a role, it actually just makes it seem funny if they're actually hamming it up. So I was talking to some mates about this, and they're talking about the ability of just changing the attitude and what the backstory is and how that changes people's behaviour. And we were just describing how actually this is what you need to do. You need to create a backstory for why the person's behaving the way they are in terms of the situation that's there. So for the actors that are in the room, why is the nurse being forgetful? And actually think about, well, what is it that's driving them to be forgetful that day? Well, actually, it's the fact that they've got a newborn baby at home. That's why they've been awake all night, and therefore they'd normally be able to give the medications appropriately and do, but actually they've just doubled the dose by accident because they had no sleep. And if they've got that in the back of their head, then that actually drives the way they act for the whole sim, and therefore they become a more consistent and real character. Because what you don't want to do is lose the reality of the situation that's there. Likewise, for the patient, how did they end up in that situation? You need to have a good story for why the patient's in the situation that they're in that makes believable sense from both a physiological point of view, but also from actually an emotional point of view. You need to make sure that the story for why were they out riding the horse makes sense, or how did they end up with the pneumonia that they've got? What is it about their backstory that makes sense? And then actually that removes some of that disbelief that people might have in a situation. You know, the questioning of, but why? And if everyone knows the story from a faculty point of view, then the whole thing does actually become consistent. And then when you're debriefing it, if someone says it doesn't make sense, you can actually explain why it makes sense, and then that actually pulls the whole thing together better from a point of view of creating a simulation that works. We've got a whole bunch of staff that are used to working in these environments. So theatres where they're listening to the constant beat, the ED where it's always a madhouse and always really busy and always a bit glamorous. But then we're going to put people into these situations. And we want people, this might be the first time that they've seen any of these situations. The thoracotomy, the car accident, the chaos of being on the road. And somehow what we need to do, especially in periods like induction or the early phases of training where people haven't been exposed to this, is actually think about how do we put them in that environment? So what happens? What's different about these two environments? And there's a lot, and really it comes down to physicality, doesn't it? It's the sights, it's the sounds, it's the smells, it's the heat of the environment, it's being cold outside, it's getting wet, it's all of those different things. And we need to somehow simulate as much as we can the environment that people are going to be working with in our retrieval setting, which is different to the environment that they're used to working in. And often the medicine is not necessarily dissimilar, it's actually the environment and the people around them that make the situation different. And so that's where sim, for our type of work, is actually different to what we would do in a hospital setting. I'm going to show you this, which is one of the simulations, and I apologise for vertical video syndrome on Jeff's behalf. But this is actually one of the simulations.
From
It really
3 years ago, before the video syndrome was described in literature.
So there are earlier references, I'm sure.
So this video is a simulation from the UK, and it kind of, the way that Jeff's actually taken the video, I think really helps to put you in the situation of what it is, including being in a vertical video syndrome. It just kind of demonstrates what you could potentially be like. So it has to stress. So what you kind of miss from this video, aside from the fact that Gigi's there being playing music, is that is actually the volume of the noise when you were doing that. Like that's actually quite quiet video that's captured there.
They had to actually shout at each other to try and communicate. Right? So trying to pick up there on the iPhone, but the volume, the noise, and everything else is just confronting.
The volume's confronting. The smells are confronting. Gigi has this lovely habit of making things smell bad. And certainly for this, it gives you that sense. And I don't know how many of you guys have been in a drug den, but certainly this certainly makes you feel like you're in the chaos and that environment that actually, without creating some of those other things, the medicine would be pretty simple. So, what would you do with each individual patient? But actually, as soon as you raise someone's stress levels and without that they're emotionally involved in the situation, then actually it means that they're changing their awareness of how they would behave if they were confronted with this again. And really, what you're trying to do is put people in a stressful enough situation to help them realise they've lost some of their situational awareness. You want to put them in a way that actually recreates an environment that they're going into, but actually you want to have them learn from that situation as much as you can. And I think that's one of the key things for simulation, is you need to put people in that enough of a heightened state to learn, but not too much of a heightened state to not learn, or not make it too farcical. Because I think that's the key thing, is that we really run the risk to make things farcical. And as soon as you make it farcical, the realism is lost. And that's one of the most important components. So if you think that the realism is about the people, the place, and then the medicine, and putting all of those things together is one of the essential things that we need to do. So I think one of the most important things is to talk about curiosity. And I know that Andrew's going to spend a lot of time probably talking about curiosity within the debriefing. And this is one of the most important things. We can set up a sim that we think is going to run in a particular way. We're absolutely certain that I'm going to give the patient anaphylactic shock in this environment, and then they're going to walk in, give a dose of IM adrenaline, and then the patient's going to feel better. But what happens? I have seen people in that situation walk in and give a milligram of IV adrenaline. I have seen them give atropine. I have seen people flat and do nothing. And it is phenomenal to watch. But what you need to do is actually one-to-one. And that's where the debrief's really important. But what you need to do when you're preparing and planning for this thing is actually think, what could they do? And don't be surprised if what you think in your head they could do is absolutely nothing like what they do when they walk into the room, and therefore you need to respond to that. So when we go back to the initial things of what other points are they, so learning objectives is a key thing, preparing and planning and thinking about the equipment that you need. And what you'll see today is we've set up several different stations worth of simulations, and with those we've really had to sit and think of, well, what do we need in each of these different sims, and that's really important. How do we actually go about doing that? And we've thought, what kit do we carry with us? What extra stuff do we need? And then how do you make it happen? How do you make it as real as you can? How do you moulage for the bleeding everywhere? How do you moulage for the fact that the patient's going to have a chest wall that's not necessarily moving correctly? Which is all really good when you've got the 3D like we've got today. But actually it comes back to the people that are around later on in the briefing of people properly, is if you as faculty can have an understanding with the faculty member that's within the scenario, you don't even need to have books for how the realism then for the running of the simulation. So with our normal mannequins, and in fact one of my favourite sims ever is actually to get a texter and draw on a white sheet in a hospital bed and have an inbuilt faculty member within the scenario, and you'll be amazed at how many people will happily intubate a drawn-on man on a sheet and think that they're seeing the larynx as they're going through and telling you that they're doing that based on the simulation of the people that are in the room. So they can actually tell someone, look, what you can do is this is what you're seeing, this is what you're feeling, and actually it's a faculty member within the sim who's talking to them as a colleague, is driving the scenario and teaching them how to do that and telling people what's there. And I think it's an interesting one, and I challenge you guys to actually try it with somebody because actually it's amazing. So the people that won't believe that generally are going to the medical students, but actually I can bet that I could draw that in front of Cliff and he'd probably get completely into the scenario and be telling me that he's seeing this and talking to a bit of text on a white sheet. And I know that might seem like it might be normal for Cliff sometimes, but I do think that actually it's part of that suspending of disbelief and actually getting involved in what's there and actually using that mental model yourself to be able to rehearse that. And I think that that's something to try. Yeah, I'm sure we could probably do it anywhere and people would be happy with the lead along with that. And it's empowering people to have their own curiosity about that, but also us being curious about how will people respond to that. And I think that's one of the really interesting and exciting things that we have the ability to do here because we are working with a bunch of people who understand the medicine and are looking to see how they respond in different situations. I'm going to leave it actually there because there's a lot more that we can talk about, but I want you guys over the course of the Sims today to think what are the learning objectives that are going on here. Consider what went on behind the magic of the Sim as such, and I think if you can think as you're watching the Sims today, if you're not participating in them, think about how you deconstruct it, what went in behind it. But also, if you're not someone that's debriefing the simulation, I'd also suggest that what you do is think, how would you debrief it? What would you think are the points that we need to take out of it? And I think that's the most important thing that we can do. Be curious about how you learn, and be curious about what other people are thinking and how they came to that conclusion and how they got to that point. Has anyone got any questions about any of that?
Might take a really great coffee then. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Clare.